Okay, I'm sorry very much. Got behind. Okay, before we begin today's hearing, I'd like to thank our witnesses. Hearing is called to order. Again, thank our witnesses. I look forward to your testimony. We're here today to continue examining the challenges facing advanced small or mid-sized businesses. To start, it is important to recognize the critical yet undervalued role mid-sized firms play in the national economy. Mid-sized firms are significant job creators and foster much-needed competition for industry leaders. The benefits they bring to the economy are similarly applicable to federal procurement systems. Unfortunately, mid-sized contractors, particularly emergent or newly graduated firms, face a dilemma. They are no longer eligible to compete for small business government contracts, yet must compete against companies across the entire middle market spectrum, which can consist of companies many times their size, up to and including the titans of industry. Firms facing this daunting prospect end up considering the following choices. First, to compete in the open market against competitors in a different weight class. Secondly, to sell their companies to large firms, resulting in net job losses to the economy. Or third, to reiterate their business models to focus on subcontracting, which inhibits growth. Or deliberately limit their progress so they remain small and therefore eligible for small business set-aside contracts. None of these options promote economic growth, spur job creation, or foster competition. Part of the problem that we have is little information about what happens after these companies are no longer considered small. Because there's no requirement to track the path of these formerly small firms, Congress cannot fully access how effective the Small Business Administration's contracting programs have been in preparing small business to engage in the open marketplace. In addition, federal procurement strategies are evolving in ways that make competition increasingly difficult for small and emergent mid-size firms. However, we begin this conversation with the clear understanding that our primary responsibility is to small businesses. We must take the greatest care to uphold and protect small businesses' ability to compete and succeed. I hope through the testimony of our witnesses that we discover ways to ensure the sustainability of small firms as they continue to mature without unduly harming existing small businesses. I now yield to the ranking member, Ms. Murphy, for her opening statement.
Chairman Knight, thank you. Thank you for holding today's important hearing. You know, Congress has created numerous federal lending programs, set-asides, and tax preferences designed to help small businesses succeed. However, the advantages conferred by these programs have led to an ongoing debate about the proper definition of a small business and what small business size standards should be used to determine eligibility for these initiatives. Size classification is especially important for firms that seek SBA loans, technical assistance, and federal contracts. And defining a small business has proven to be a challenging endeavor. While one definition may work for a business in one context, it may be unsuitable in another. For instance, what works for a manufacturing company in California might not be appropriate for a tech startup in Florida. On numerous occasions, the SBA has proposed a comprehensive revision of its size standards. However, it remains critical for policymakers to engage directly with stakeholders about any potential revisions and their impact on middle market businesses. That is, firms that have grown out of their small size status but are not considered large billion-dollar enterprises. This hearing gives us an opportunity to better understand how well small business size standards are working in practice and the challenges that advanced small and mid-sized businesses are currently facing, especially as it relates to federal procurement. For example, mid-sized businesses are too large to qualify for small business set-aside contracts, yet they must compete on the full and open marketplace against billion-dollar firms. Reports suggest that mid-sized firms have limited options. Those that forego competing in full and open markets often settle for subcontracting opportunities or decide to sell their company at a devalued rate. Access to federal contracting opportunities is critical for small and mid-sized firms and essential to job creation and economic growth. While increasing competition for federal contracts is a bipartisan goal on this committee, we must consider whether revisions to the small business definition will prove to be insufficiently inclusive or overly inclusive of mid-sized firms to the detriment of small businesses. On the one hand, advanced small and mid-sized firms that are excluded from the small business definition are often barred from participating in some small business contracting programs. On the other hand, if a size standard were to become overly inclusive, businesses that would otherwise be considered large would be able to compete in these programs, depriving small businesses of contracting opportunities. So today we'll hear from multiple industries that have been affected by the standards in place as of October 2017. I want to be clear that the purpose of today's hearing is not to advocate for one size standard over another, but rather to better understand the industry perspectives and ways in which we can encourage as much competition in the federal marketplace as possible. I thank all the witnesses for their attendance and look forward to hearing your insight on this issue. Thank you, and I yield back.
Okay, thank you very much. If committee members have an opening statement prepared, I ask that they be submitted for the record. Now I'd like to take a moment to explain the timing. You have 5 minutes for your opening statement. When it goes yellow, that means you got a minute. When it goes red, start to round it up. Again, my apologies for being late. I'd like to now formally introduce our witnesses. Our first witness is Mr. Stephen Ramali. He is an experienced government contracts lawyer and a subject matter expert on federal procurement matters. Mr. Ramali has prosecuted and defended bid protests before the U.S. Court of Federal Claims, executive branch agencies, and the Government Accountability Office. We welcome you and look forward to your testimony. Our second witness is Ms. Lisa Firestone. Ms. Firestone is the president and owner of Managed Care Advisors Incorporated, a women-owned small business based in Bethesda, Maryland. Managed Care Advisors, or MCA, provides an array of healthcare consulting services to various public and private customers. Both the customer and Ms. Firestone have won a number of distinguished accolades in the past several years. Ms. Firestone is also the chair of the board of directors of Women Impacting Public Policy and will be testifying in that capacity today. Thank you very much for being here. Our third witness is Mr. Mehul Sanghani. I got it. Mr. Sanghani is the Chief Executive Officer and founder of Octo Consulting Group based in Reston, Virginia. Octo Consulting delivers complex IT strategies and business transformation engagements for Global 100 corporations and federal government agencies. Over the last decade, Mr. Sanghani has grown the firm from an 8A certified small business into a successful mid-size IT consulting firm. We welcome you and look forward to your testimony. Now I'd like to yield to the ranking member to introduce Ms. Griffin.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce Ms. Eminence Northcutt Griffin. Ms. Griffin serves as the Director of Federal Procurement and Counsel for the Information Technology Alliance for the Public Sector, or ITAPS, a division of the Information Technology Industry Council where she works to develop policy and advance the interests of the IT sector as it relates to federal procurement. Prior to joining ITAPS, Eminence spent more than 6 years as the Procurement Counsel on the House Small Business Committee, so welcome home. A proud Red Raider, Eminence earned a Bachelor's of Arts in History and Political Science from Texas Tech University and a JD from St. Mary's University School of Law. Welcome, Ms. Griffin, and thank you for testifying today.
Thank you very much. And now, Mr. Ramali, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chair Knight and Ranking Member Murphy. I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify on this important topic. My name, as Chair Knight indicated, is Steve Ramali. I'm an associate attorney in the Government Contracts Law Practice Group at Miles and Stockbridge, PC. However, today I am not testifying on behalf of my firm or any of our clients. I'm here on behalf of the 800-member Montgomery County, Maryland Chamber of Commerce and as an active member of its GovConNet Council. The council meets monthly to tackle federal contracting issues. In the federal contracting marketplace, as of 2018, there are approximately 1,700 medium or mid-size companies, defined by Bloomberg as firms with $25 million to $500 million in annual revenue. That compares to roughly 118,000 small businesses and 110 vendors who are large, with annual revenues in excess of $500 million. So mid-sized vendors account for only 1.4% of all vendors to the federal government. And actually, if you take that number down to exclude any mid-sizes that receive set-aside dollars, that number shrinks to about 325 total vendors, which is only approximately 0.3% of all federal contractors. So, you stated the problem quite succinctly. As a small business becomes larger, it is inevitable that the business owners will face a choice. Grow beyond the small business programs to compete with large companies, stay small, sell the business, or go out of business. Unfortunately, the Chamber's experience is that more and more firms are being forced to make those latter choices: stay small, sell, or go out of business. Graduated firms are having trouble competing against established larger companies. The SBA's size standards define a company's eligibility for the small business programs. Currently, the highest revenue standard is $38.5 million, which is applicable to firms in industries such as financial services and aerospace engineering. A business in those industries cannot have more than $38.5 million in annual receipts averaged over the previous 3 years to qualify as small. In brainstorming how to help mid-sized companies compete, the Chamber's GovConNet Council, which is comprised of practitioners and business owners involved in government contracting, concluded that a major cause of the no man's land is that small firms are becoming large too quickly. Government contractors experience a unique pattern in their growth. Revenue growth can be mercurial, sometimes hovering in the single digits and then exploding over 2 or 3 years. This pattern of sudden growth is increasingly common because of the government's more frequent use of large contract vehicles under which contractors can be awarded huge task orders. It's not unusual for a contractor to win a single task order that on its own bumps the contractor out of the small business programs. So this leads me to the Chamber's first recommendation: change the SBA formula for small business eligibility. Our proposal was to allow companies to look back 5 years rather than 3 and choose their lowest 3 years for purposes of calculating size eligibility. The Chamber's GovConNet Council believes that this change would give larger small businesses more runway to adjust to their rapid growth, but would still protect the smaller businesses under the various SBA programs. So the rationale behind this proposed change can be stated pretty simply. Competitiveness takes time to build. Revenue is not an indicator of present competitiveness, it is an indicator of future competitiveness. Firms need time to recruit talented employees, develop their intellectual property, and build infrastructure and past performance to compete at the next level. Moving from a 3-year look back to a lowest 3 in the last 5 would allow more time to adjust to the full and open marketplace. In addition to our lowest 3 in the last 5 proposal, the Chamber is offering another measure. We propose allowing companies to subtract independent research and development expenses from total revenue for size determination purposes. This change would support the government's initiative to stimulate technological and biomedical innovation and would allow companies to continue to pursue and develop new products and processes without penalty. Currently, firms who invest in R&D often do so at the expense of their present competitiveness. For firms at the cusp of becoming large, every revenue dollar counts and must be brought to bear to help win the next contract award, which will maximize revenue streams to support that company while it transitions to full and open. This dynamic effectively discourages R&D investment. Allowing a firm to subtract its R&D expenses, as defined by the IRS, from its size receipts would not only support innovation, but it would also remove one barrier to small business contractors investing in their own futures. Let me wrap up this testimony by summarizing what the Chamber believes to be at stake here. Small business programs exist to ensure supplier diversity that spurs innovation and guards against supplier consolidation and non-competitive pricing. And of course, as Chair Knight indicated, small businesses produce a lot of jobs, perhaps the majority of American jobs. With our proposals, we want to facilitate success, however, not cause it. We recognize that each company must succeed on its own merit. However, without a greater number of firms crossing the no man's land to compete with large businesses, the federal contractor ecosystem will suffer. We believe our proposals move us in the right direction, but no doubt there are even more measures that could be taken. We look forward to working with this subcommittee, and sincerely thank you for your time, your attention to this matter, and for your invitation to participate today.
Thank you very much. Ms. Firestone, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chair Knight and Ranking Member Murphy. As you introduced me, I'm Lisa Firestone, President and CEO of Managed Care Advisors. We're a health services company located in Bethesda, Maryland, and Lake Mary, Florida. I'm testifying today, as you said, on behalf of Women Impacting Public Policy as chair of their board of directors. WIP is a nonpartisan public policy organization that advocates on behalf of women entrepreneurs. Let me give you a little bit of background on my company. We were established in 1997 and began as a boutique healthcare consulting company specializing in employee health benefits, managed care, and workers' compensation. Today, we're the leading provider of federal workers' compensation case management services, currently operating in all 50 states and all U.S. territories. How we transformed from a 4-person consulting company to a thriving federal contractor with more than 120 employees has been long, difficult, and very fulfilling. In 2003, my company was asked to come and work on a congressionally mandated study to assess the feasibility of applying industry best practices for managing work-related injuries and illnesses for employees who are covered under FECA. This initial introduction to federal contracting was a turning point for my company. We identified a market with unmet demand. We designed a path forward for meeting that demand and learned very quickly that we had a lot to learn about government contracting. In 2005, we were awarded our first government contract as part of a joint venture. Since winning our largest contract to date in 2007, which was $53 million, we've experienced double-digit growth year over year. Where double-digit growth has always been a source of pride, we're now facing the reality that if we have a year that exceeds 36% growth, that will take us from small to mid-size, requiring us to reinvent ourselves in order to continue to grow and remain relevant in the federal market. With that said, I feel my company is a poster child for the issue that we're discussing today. The size standard for our company is $15 million. We currently represent 16 federal agencies, with the average size of our contracts ranging from $1.5 million to $53 million, with annual task orders averaging about $1.2 million. It's not hard to see how a company like mine will and can exceed this size standard relatively quickly. We're now at a crossroads. Our executive team has spent significant resources putting together a plan to survive in the federal mid-sized world. I'm loath to restrict my growth to stay in the small business program. It runs counter to my entrepreneurial instincts, and it certainly is not good for the economy or the thousands of injured federal employees who count on us every day to support their recovery and return to work. The reality is that there, as everybody has said, there's limited choices for companies like mine. I acquire or I get acquired. I join forces with a large contractor as a subcontractor when they have existing contracting vehicles. Or I revamp my marketing and sales strategy, including one important point. How am I going to maintain contracts that have been small business set-asides in the past? It seems to me that the federal government should seek to keep businesses like mine as contractors. We've honed our technical and contracting expertise to fit the needs of federal government. We have the infrastructure and resources in place to support it, and we have very successful past performance. The topic of size standards and the great abyss between small and large is frequent discussion among the members of WIP. On one hand, the federal government encourages us to grow, but on the other, its policies restrict that growth. WIP is a partner in the Montgomery County Chamber of Commerce Pathway to Growth initiative as described by Mr. Ramali. And as they said, these two modest proposals will give companies like mine greater opportunities for successful and sustained transition to mid-sized firms. WIP represents companies of all sizes who are competing in the federal market. And I don't believe that these changes we are proposing today will take away any opportunities from the smaller companies. If anything, these changes will provide a greater path growth potential. I hope the committee will also look at the NAICS code size review that the SBA is about to embark on. As I said, I have a $15 million size standard. While that might sound like a big number, it's not keeping up with the size of government contracts and task orders. I urge you to examine whether these SPA size standards will allow small businesses to compete for single and or multiple award contracts and become mid-sized contractors. Last year, Senators Ernst and Gillibrand championed a study that required SBA to analyze small business participation in multiple award contracts, and we look forward to seeing that. To conclude, women-owned businesses like mine have continued to grow and post impressive numbers. We're a strong economic force in the United States and increasingly in the world. More than 36% of all businesses are women-owned and are growing at 4 times the rate of male-owned businesses. In 2016, we created 8.9 million jobs and generated $1.6 trillion in revenue. Despite this contribution, these businesses are still 21% less likely to get government contracts. Let's work together to make sure we reward growth and not stifle it. If we solve this problem, we will continue to create jobs, increase our contribution to the economy, and maintain a strong industrial base. Thank you so much for having me here and letting me represent women-owned businesses who have a voice in this important hearing.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Sangani, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Terrific. Good morning, Chairman Knight, Ranking Member Murphy, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the invitation to appear today. My name is Mehul Sangani, and I'm the founder and chief executive officer of Octo Consulting Group, a nationally recognized and award-winning technology solutions and management consulting firm located in Northern Virginia. It is a privilege and an honor for me to share my views on how we can encourage entrepreneurship and growth among small and mid-sized contractors. Before I begin, let me state that my comments are my own and I'm not speaking formally on behalf of my company. I founded Octo Consulting Group in 2006 with a focus on providing cutting-edge technology solutions and consulting services to the federal government. We grew from being a subcontractor to large prime contractor in our early days to now what we feel is an award-winning firm that today employs over 400 employees and performs as a prime contractor on 90% of its work for agencies all over the federal government. Aside from our hard work and innovation in technology, this growth was made possible by Octo's participation in set-aside programs like the 8A program. Now we're beginning to try to pass on what we have learned through the SBA Mentor Protege program. Through these programs, I am acutely aware that many small businesses struggle to compete with large multi-billion-dollar companies once they outgrow their size status and lose small business protections. Once a small business has exceeded its primary size standard, which can be as low as $15 million in annual revenue for consulting services, it is no longer entitled to participate in small business programs and is then considered a mid-tier company competing against the largest businesses in the government contracting market. Mid-tier companies are no longer afforded the preferential protections enjoyed by small business government contractors. They instead must directly compete for prime contracts with these multi-billion-dollar firms such as Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics. Worse still, mid-tier businesses are no longer attractive subcontracting partners because they cannot help these large, oftentimes billion-dollar contractors meet their subcontracting quotas and targets for small business participation. Small businesses on the verge of graduating from the program often choose between two choices: be acquired by a large business or attempt to compete with those large businesses. Should a small business choose to try to continue to grow and compete with those large businesses, certain policy changes would aid them in this endeavor. 1, eliminate the trend towards quantitative competitions, self-scoring based on the number or size of contracts a firm has been awarded. And you've seen that in a number of recent GWACs that have been awarded across the government. Incentivize mid-tier businesses to work together by requiring consideration of each team member's past performance. And in 3, in multiple award contracts, require that small and recently graduated small businesses be able to compete for unrestricted task orders. In addition to these simple policy changes, I would urge you to reconsider a pilot program that was suggested in a bill called the Small Business Growth Act that created a program for set-aside contractors with fewer than 1,500 employees who otherwise do not qualify as a small business. The GSA would have been able to set aside contracts for these businesses when the contract was not otherwise set aside for small businesses. While I understand there is some skepticism for a new set-aside category, this program would be incredibly helpful to mid-tier companies or small businesses as they make that transition. So 1, eliminate these quantitative competitions based on the number of size or size of contracts a firm has been awarded. And 2, incentivize businesses. And then 3, in multiple award contracts, require that these small businesses be able to compete. As the committee is no doubt aware, billions of dollars in federal contracts are now awarded through large government-wide contracts that are held by a smaller number of contractors. For example, in fiscal year 2017, some $6 billion in sales went through GWACs, or government-wide acquisition contracts administered by GSA. Award on such a vehicle can make or break a company and its future success. However, currently agencies assign point scores that account for the number of contracts a firm has performed, the overall size of those contracts, or whether those contracts were cost type or fixed price. Even the best mid-tier firms do not have the same number of contracts as the market's multi-billion-dollar industry leaders. To preserve competition, I would ask this committee to consider specific legislation requiring that multiple award competitions not be based on mathematical self-scoring of the number of large contracts a firm has performed, but instead that these contracts be accessible to mid-tier firms with agencies required to review the quality of the work these firms have performed. So, along the lines of my second recommendation, it is common for mid-tier firms to join forces to compete with the scale of large businesses. However, many solicitations do not allow a prime contractor to benefit from the experience of its subcontractors. This is a huge disadvantage to those mid-tier companies who do not yet have the experience to compete alone against the industry leaders. To fix this issue, agencies should be required to consider the past performance experience and skills of both prime contractors and significant subcontractors, just like we do under the SBA Mentor Protege program. Additionally, small and mid-tier businesses do not have very much prime contracting experiences, but solicitations will often refuse to consider an offeror's past performance as a sub. This committee should consider legislation that requires agencies to consider a firm's prior work as a subcontractor if it is relevant to the prime contract at issue. And then finally, as you know, small businesses that hold large, multiple award contracts are often not allowed to compete with large businesses and are frozen out when they grow out of the small business size status. To encourage competition and incentivize growth, I suggest that small businesses should be allowed to compete on both set-aside and full and open task orders under these large multiple award contracts. Further, once the small business graduates, it should be able to stay on the vehicle and compete on any full and open task orders. This small, subtle change will give small businesses more opportunities even as they grow into mid-tier firms. In conclusion, I would like to commend this committee for considering the plight of firms that graduate from the small business program. Mid-tier companies have much to offer the government contracts marketplace and should be afforded an opportunity to continue to grow. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Griffin, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Knight, Ranking Member Murphy, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to share our perspective on challenges that exist in the federal marketplace for graduated small businesses. The IT Alliance for Public Sector represents approximately 90 of the leading innovative government contractors in the IT market. The health of small businesses is important to our members as they utilize these firms not only as subcontractors, but many of them sell their products to the government via small business resellers. As such, we understand some of the difficulties that graduated small businesses face as they seek continued participation in the marketplace, and we believe the answer lies in creating a more robust small business contracting program. As a result of the existing small business programs and goals, we have seen increased dollars awarded to small businesses and more of these firms graduating out of their size. While these are laudable achievements, we rarely look beyond the dollars awarded to determine whether we are growing healthier small businesses that have the tools to succeed in the full and open market once they graduate. Currently, only the 8A Business Development Program monitors the contracts and growth of its participants. However, after a firm's 9-year term ends, the SBA ceases its tracking efforts. The SBA does not track whether small businesses can successfully compete in the marketplace after they outgrow their size standards. However, this information is needed in order to promote sustainable growth in small business participants and for the overall success of the programs themselves. Further, more could be done to ensure fair distribution of the contracting dollars among a variety of small firms. We have seen agencies set aside increasingly large percentages of their small business dollars to a limited number of NAICS codes, particularly in IT, where their percentages are as high as 40 to 60% at some agencies. This does not create a healthy industrial base and leaves limited funds and opportunities available for competition among other businesses, particularly those in the middle market. Also, large set-asides have become increasingly common, and as a result, some small businesses are left out of the market, while the awardees quickly outgrow their size standard without the ability to compete in the full and open market. This decreases contract opportunities for other businesses and reduces the ability to enhance the nation's industrial and manufacturing base. While the set-aside process needs improvement, ITAPS recognizes the competitive marketplace is not perfect either. The process has become timely and costly, sometimes preventing businesses from competing with large IDIQs, leaving firms shuttered out of the market for periods of 5 to 10 years. We need increased transparency into the process and on-ramps onto these contracts to help small and middle market businesses compete. Greater transparency is also needed through post-award debriefings to those offerors who lost the contracts to help them become more competitive. In a report released earlier this year, RAND Corporation found that better debriefings could help the offeror understand why they lost and potentially prevent protest. Yet even when a business wins a competition, obstacles remain. Though accelerated payments are helpful for businesses of all sizes, only small businesses are eligible to receive them. A permanent extension of faster payments, as proposed in H.R. 5337, the Accelerated Payments for Small Businesses Act, is an easy way to cut some of the red tape out of the acquisition system. The Mentor Protege program also provides an opportunity for healthy growth in small businesses, as they open a vast array of learning opportunities in areas like cybersecurity and regulatory compliance. ITAPS believes these programs are vital in building sustainable firms, and middle market businesses have an important role to play in imparting firsthand knowledge on transitioning from small to middle market. Joint ventures or teaming arrangements can also play a role when an acquisition is too big for a small business to fulfill alone. Yet the fear of affiliation prevents small businesses from seizing these opportunities. As such, the rules governing affiliation should be simplified and modernized to more closely align to the business structures that have developed over the past 3 decades. Lastly, fraud and abuse continue to permeate the various small business programs, and as a result, small businesses and others are prevented from competing for contracts. Until agencies take real action against these bad actors, fraudulent actions will continue and businesses will lose opportunities to compete. ITAPS believes the recommendations set forth here and further discussed in my written testimony outline the steps needed to create a healthy and vibrant industrial base across businesses of all sizes. Members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to testify, and I would be happy to answer your questions.
Well, thank you very much. I have a few questions, but then I want to kind of roll down and get everybody's idea of this. Ms. Firestone, you said something that I think all of us took note of. Plan to survive when you are doubling in growth. What is my plan to survive when my business is doing so well? And I think that kind of hits at the heart of what small business is about. Small business is about making sure that your idea and your hard work is paying off, and paying off means I'm probably growing, I'm hiring more people, I'm expanding, doing all those things. But then when you start to move out of small business and you might be leaving some of the contracts or the advantages of being a small business, how do I survive in the next step? That's something that shouldn't be, all right? So that's not my question, that's just my statement.
I agree.
Okay. So I guess my question is, we talk about a small business or a small big or something like that. When you move into kind of a mid-sized arena, what are your advantages of being in that arena, and what are your advantages of maybe us saying you're a small business and then the cutoff is here for that certain industry, or you're a large business and you lose all the advantages of being in a small business category?
Well, for us, when I got into government contracting, it was something that I said, okay, here's a demand, and we started to grow. And, your size standard looks pretty far off when you're starting with 4 people and you're like, yay, I just got $250,000 this year. So, for us, as we continue to grow, it's not, we learned government contracting. We learned the advantage of small businesses and small business set-asides and the reasons for it, right? Nobody's handing you a contract. You have to win those contracts. You technically have to be very, very good. And sometimes I think you have to be better than the big companies because the perception of risk. So for us, as we're growing, as I said, we're about 36. If we have another year, so we've been growing year over year, anywhere from 30%, 20%, 15, 50% one year. If we have another year where we grow 36%, we're done in our size standard. And for us, it's something where we have to be concerned not only about not competing on future small business awards, but all of the contracts that we've gotten in the past that are small business that may be up for recompete or may still have 3 years left on them. So what do we do about those customers, right? So that's a big problem. So I think, looking at some of the things we looked at today, like the lowest 3 out of 5. If you're growing, year over year, you can have a big year or 2 big years, and it allows you to grow a little bit and get closer to that size. There's a big gap between $15 million company and the infrastructure you have and the ability to compete with a $100 or $500 million company. So I think looking at enabling us to stay within that size standard or raise the size standard so that we can compete with the $100 million, or I personally, our company, we're right now examining, do we sell, right?
Right,
And if we look at that, the first question that people come in and ask is, how many of your contracts are small business?
Well, when you start out a business, obviously, you're not looking at, boy, I could get this contract, I could do this, I could do
Right.
this. Your first thing is, how do I survive and how do
Exactly. Make
I,
payroll.
make payroll? But when you're selling, yeah, somebody who's going to come in is going to say, okay, well, this actually becomes a liability for me if I'm looking at all of the different things on your ledger. So my second question is, there are multiple award contracts, and this might be for Mr. O'Malley, that do allow streamline on-ramping from small business contracts to the unrestricted contract. The General Services Administration comes to mind. Why has this common sense practice not been adopted across multiple award contracts?
It's true what you just said. There are some on-ramps. I've been colloquially referring to them as up-ramps. It's, when a small business either recertifies or grows out of its size, they get moved up to the large business track. And the problem is it's not mandatory in the FAR. That's a permissive thing that you can set up in your, a CO might put that in a solicitation. I think Mr. Sangani hit the nail on the head that making that more mandatory would be a good step. This is not something I've vetted with the chambers. This is my own personal opinion, but I've seen that really hurt the value of those multiple award contracts in an acquisition context, and also incentivize people to not want to grow because they know they're not going to be able to use that vehicle anymore. And they put all that B&P, the bid and proposal costs, into obtaining that contract, and then they can't use it. And that sort of dovetails with the greater point that this, increased use of MACs, multiple award contracts, I don't think that's going away. The government knows they can get a good value by doing that. That's sort of part and parcel to the bundling and consolidation discussion that this committee I know has had. And we need to probably address the fact that that's not going away and come up with creative solutions to work within the confines of that paradigm. And so our proposals and the ones you've heard today, I think, help.
Okay, thank you. And now I'd like to yield time to the ranking member, Ms. Murphy.
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. Griffin, in your written testimony, you provided a number of recommendations to improve small business contracting programs, including developing and tracking metrics of small businesses and graduated small businesses that compete in the full and open marketplace. How can the committee implement what you've suggested using the existing databases?
So the federal procurement database system is able to track each contractor through their DUNS number, and you can see what type of contracts they are getting, whether it's set aside. You can even filter down into the type of set aside, whether it be women-owned or small business, if it's a sole source. But you can also see how they're competing in the full and open competition. So if a company is relying solely on set-asides, we can use that data to then look and see how we can transition them into full and open competitions, whether that be increased training, send them for increased training at small business development centers or women business centers. But the data is there. SBA just needs to pull it out. And they have, which companies are enrolled in 8A, which ones are enrolled in HubZone. When the Women-Owned Small Business Certification Program is put in place, they'll have that data too. The one question will be service disabled and solely small businesses that don't have to go through a certification process.
So what factors other than the type of set-aside and job creation stats do you think that we should track?
I think revenue is very important. As you heard here today, revenue is what makes you either a small or a graduated small. And so that is not tracked. You can kind of look at it based on the contracts, but how their fiscal years are calculated, revenue is another important factor.
Great. As you know, larger IDIQs and subcontracts have become more prevalent in government contracting. These opportunities are especially attractive for small and mid-sized businesses looking to expand and grow their revenues. What mechanisms currently exist for small and mid-sized businesses to win these opportunities, and how do you think they should be improved?
Sorry, me. I think that there are mechanisms that already exist in how a contract is framed that could provide better clarity to those that are competing, what they need to have. And so lowest price technically acceptable, for instance, that's gonna favor people that are able to lower their price. So if you move those awards to best value, mid-tiers, smaller businesses are able to compete more on the best value because they have that ability to provide better customer service or what have you.
Great, thanks. And then this question's open to the panel. As you know, there's no federally recognized definition of mid-size and a lack of empirical data tracking the trajectory of firms that graduate out of the small size standard. This means that we don't necessarily have a clear picture of the number of jobs that are created by these emergent small firms, and we don't know which industries are contributing to or hindering middle market growth. The success or failure rate of these firms, et cetera. We just don't have that information. My office has frequently called upon the assistance of Grow Florida, and I don't know, Ms. Firestone, you said you're in Lake Mary, Florida, which is in my district. You might be aware of Grow Florida. It's basically a statewide economic development program focused on assisting second-stage growth companies in Florida, but we rely on them for this type of data. Grow Florida is tracking all the information that I listed above, and it's been really instrumental in helping Central Florida identify ways to strengthen our entrepreneurial ecosystem. Can you elaborate on why it's critical for us to have access to this data at a national scale, and in what way would you suggest that we go about collecting it?
I think one thing that's noteworthy, and I'm not sure if Mr. Romali made reference to it, but there have been some empirical studies that have taken a hard look at not just the definition of the mid-market and how we define a mid-sized firm, but also gaining access to information that is publicly available in some of the systems that Ms. Griffin talked about, and FPDS and other data sources that define the size and the scale of the market. When you look at it anecdotally, and in terms of, my own experience, this is a burgeoning area of the marketplace in terms of the services that are being delivered. If you look at the marketplace itself, it's a $1 trillion market. At the top, what have you seen? You've seen a tremendous amount of consolidation amongst some of these billion-dollar behemoths. The big are getting bigger in order to compete at a scale necessary to capture an even larger share of the marketplace. And then you have a ton of small businesses, several 100,000 that compete for what amounts to about 20% of the remaining dollars. And then when we look at the mid-tier, I believe there are about 1,500 companies that represent about 25 to 500 million in size that are a significant component of that supply base. So I challenge the committee in terms of how they look when they look at this marketplace. They look at those trends. I challenge the committee to look at any other component of the economy where you look at it in terms of your success and how that's tied to your survivability. I'm so successful, I may not be able to survive going forward. I don't know of many other components of our economy or industries that kind of have that conundrum. And so when you look at it from the perspective of the size of the market, $1 trillion, when you look at it from the perspective of what's good for the economy, what's good for the taxpayer, what's good for the jobs of businesses like ours, I don't think you can look at any of those dimensions and say that there isn't room for policy to address this challenge going forward. So, again, I'll let the other folks on the committee chime in, but I do believe there's ample data in some of these databases that exist publicly to allow you to not only get a snapshot, but really get a pulse for this issue. And I believe, again, when you look at it anecdotally relative to the some of the issues and trends at the top of the marketplace, I think what you see is an industry that is heavily fragmented, and you see an industry where you might be left, if you don't look at this from a policy perspective, with just 100 businesses that occupy 90% of that trillion-dollar market. And across any of those dimensions, the economy, the taxpayer, the jobs, I can't see that being beneficial.
Thank you, Mr. Sangani. And also thank you to the witnesses. Mr. Chairman, I'm really sorry, but I have to excuse myself. But thank you all for being here.
Thank you very much. Okay, we've heard from California, we've heard from Florida, we're going to hear from South Carolina. Mr. Norman, you are recognized.
Thank you, panel, for taking the time to come. Mr. Sangani, I'm a small business owner, run a real estate company. One of the things we try to do and do on a regular basis is get with our customers to ask, what can we do better, what can change? Does the SBA need to reconsider the size requirements and how that's determined, in your opinion?
I absolutely do. And I believe, Ms. Firestone made reference to the fact that there is, perhaps some efforts underway to take a look at the size standards associated with that. The one thing I will say is, from the SBA's perspective in terms of its mission, they have a wide-ranging mission in support of a large community of small businesses. And, they have, I think there's ample room for improvement. We've talked about it here from a policy perspective. And I'll talk about the NAICS codes in a second. But, they don't have a lot of resources sometimes to address those policy changes. So I did want to state that first and foremost. But, when you look at these NAICS codes, I believe Senator McCaskill, took a hard look at this several years ago. This is an outdated system in many ways for industrial classification. It's the best system that we have, perhaps, in terms of what legacy historically we've been looking at. But do I think that there's room for reconsideration of whether a system that was established, I believe, in the 1920s is appropriate for determining size? Absolutely. And do I think there's room for consideration of, what I've talked about here from a policy perspective is an important component of the industrial base in terms of its contribution to that trillion-dollar market and what's happening at the top? Absolutely. There should be, an aggressive look at what's appropriate going forward.
I guess as a follow-up, how would we get specific in implementing that? And this for the panel. What do you suggest we do to get to have effective change and to put it in practice?
I'd like to address that briefly. Our proposals deal with a range of addressing a range of the problems caused by the current system. So currently, SBA is actually about to undergo their 5-year review of their NAICS code standards, and I think we're all supportive of that review. And likely that review will result in increasing of size standards for certain industries. Part of the problem that we've identified isn't just where the point cutoff is, it's how fast companies are reaching it. It's the idea that they're reaching it so fast that they aren't able to take that money and bring it to bear in their own competitiveness by investing and recruiting people. So our proposals are trying to address a slightly different problem than just the size standard being too low, right? So what we've proposed is instead of measuring companies over 3 years of their annual receipts, to measure them over 5 years, but actually to choose the 3 lowest of the last 5, so that companies will be able to exclude sort of an outlier, boom year, and with that boom may not actually really reflect their present competitiveness. We've also proposed a number of things like allowing certain deductions to their annual receipts, such as the R&D expenses, for example. Another group has proposed allowing folks to deduct subcontracting dollars from receipts. These are all these are specific proposals aimed at trying to recognize what a company's true size is and true competitiveness is without throwing everybody and every dollar in the same bucket, right? So.
And I would also add, I'm not sure about the size standard changes that they're making, but I think generally the size standards don't reflect the current marketplace and how businesses lay out their business plans. I don't know many businesses that do, a 3-year business plan. It's, 5-year, 10-year projections, et cetera. And I would also say, with regards to Mr. Singhani's comment about the NAICS codes themselves, the various industry classifications, they were never meant to do size standards. They were meant for trade. And so we need to start looking at other ways to differentiate the sectors and the industries, because I think that is also causing a problem.
Great.
Right, and I think from a small business standpoint, it's also a matter of business requirements are changing. I know you had a hearing on the Hill yesterday on cybersecurity. The requirements I have to meet and the requirements a large business have to meet are exactly the same. So I think as you look at the size, you also have to look at, I have to invest $1 million as a healthcare company in cybersecurity, but so does a multi-billion-dollar company. So as I look at the size and what we've invested over time, is it really realistic at a 15 million size standard to then take that what we've invested and actually be able to utilize, fully utilize that?
Great. I think I'm out of time. I yield back to the chairman.
Thank you very much, and I think that's a good point, Ms. Firestone. We look at some things that small business has to do that large business has to do on the same exact scale. If I've got, 200 attorneys on staff, and you've got because typically the owner of the business is the attorney, the payroll, the everything at some point during the business. You're looking at part of that now. I've got to either hire out attorneys, I've got to figure out expertise, or I've got to hopefully draw from somebody inside my company that can help me with this. That doesn't always happen. So we've looked at that, and we are trying to work on that. I think that is a vital point. Okay, on to the great state of Pennsylvania. Mr. Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. This morning, I saw the timing release of the Philadelphia Federal Reserve Report on Diversity and Inclusion. And I want to take a moment to read from the letter of the president of the Federal Reserve of that district. He basically said, my letter last year was the why. My letter this year is the how. Diversity and inclusion are not add-ons. What he also says, diversity and inclusion have to be deeply ingrained aspects of working culture. It needs to be so fully a part of what we do and who we are that it has its own muscle memory. I want to start off with that as setting the tone for my questioning, and no coincidental that we have two women testifying on this committee. So I'm going to start out with Ms. Griffin. You point out in your testimony that the only 8A business development program does continuous monitoring. Given your familiarity with this program from your work here as a staffer and now in the private sector, if we are writing legislation for other programs to perform the same type of monitoring and oversight, how would it differ, if at all?
I don't think that it needs to differ. I think that the same type of growth that you want in the 8A firm, you want in a women-owned small business, you want in a service disabled, you want in a hub zone. And in the business opportunities that 8As have, they have additional availability in partnerships and joint ventures that the other the other categories don't have. So it's a great program that has built sustainable businesses like my colleague here. So I think that the continuous tracking has helped them in their ability to grow.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Firestone, your business is located inside the Beltway nearby Montgomery County, Maryland. Apparently, it has been able to prosper. I represent Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, just outside Philadelphia. Could you address the role that a small business geographically might play in getting contracts or even being aware of that possibility exists?
Getting federal contracts?
Yes.
With me.
The location.
I'm located right
right
outside the Beltway.
Right.
And, obviously being that close to the nation's capital, you would think that's how I got into government contracting. But I think the real reason I got into government contracting was my technical knowledge and so in the past. So that's how I actually got in. Somebody called me because they knew I was an expert in case management. However, representing women impacting public policy, being within the Beltway has helped, being close to the District of Columbia and to the seat of government. But we represent women all over the country, and I think the key to that is SBA. It's Women Impacting Public Policy. It's the Montgomery County Chamber. It's people that are advocating on behalf of women and other minorities, and really educate us on how do we get into federal procurement? Why do we get into federal procurement? So I don't think it's, you know, just around the Beltway issue. As a matter of fact, WIP is growing regionally, you know, at an expanding rate for that reason, to make sure we're representative of the entire country and all the products and services they have to offer.
I don't want to leave out the two gentlemen. Any reaction to what you have just heard? I only have like a minute left on my.
Sure, I'll be brief. I think the need for additional outreach outside the Beltway is something that there's a consensus behind. SBA has been doing that through the PTACs and other various mechanisms that they have sprinkled throughout the country to let people know about federal contracting opportunities. Those opportunities or those efforts could always be strengthened. And I think you'd see real returns on it because there is a skew towards the Beltway. And that doesn't need to happen, particularly in 2018. It's a, you know, global economy. It's a, you know, lots of online businesses can even survive, you know, with the federal government as their customer. So looking elsewhere would be beneficial, I think.
No, totally concur. I think one of the things in addition to outreach, I think is, you know, where are the buying centers associated with that industrial base? Our firm has employees in Boston, Atlanta, San Antonio as points of presence, and these are all major buying centers. I've been up to the Naval Supply Center up in Philadelphia, outside your district, and so I mean it really comes down to these buying centers and their center of gravity and their ability to not only, you know, award contracts, but award contracts that support the industrial base just outside their door.
Just to add to that, our contract, living in the environment we do, we work in now. We have employees in 30 states, so we're really be able to reach out using technology.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You break the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Comer, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to the Small Business Committee. My first question is for Mr. Romilly. Did I get that right?
Ramaley, but
Ramaley.
don't worry about it.
Where I'm from, we mispronounce everything. So
That's fine.
Regarding your proposal to subtract, and if somebody's asked this question, I apologize, but regarding your proposal to subtract research and development costs from the revenue total when calculating size, how much do firms typically spend on R&D as a percentage or dollar amount of their total budget?
It's a great question. It's actually, I think, what motivated our proposal in some sense, because the answer is right now, not a lot. Not a lot is spent by smalls, and that's what we're trying to change a little bit. Our perception, and this is admittedly our perception, there's not a lot of data out there on this subject, but folks don't want to spend that money because they need it now. They need to be positioned to survive once they go large, and that means every dollar that comes in needs to be invested in present or near future competitiveness, and that means recruitment, that means B&P, bid and proposal costs. So that we wanted to sort of piggyback off an already stated objective of the federal government to encourage innovation, encourage research and development, but not continue to disincentivize it by punishing firms who spend dollars there. Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to attempt this.
Sangani.
Thank you. That's what I was going to say.
That's right.
Yeah. You mentioned that the past performance, experience, and skills of both prime and significant subcontractors should be considered. What do you mean by significant subcontractors?
Well, I think if you have, and again, I think in order to be able to compete against some of the firms that I've described, I think you kind of have to stand on each other's shoulders to be able to be able to compete at that level. And so I think that there are, you know, different definitions of what could be considered a significant subcontractor, but from my perspective, anyone performing at least 20% of the work on a contract, 20 to 25% of the work on a contract, I think should be deemed a significant subcontractor. There again, and I think just to follow up on what Mr. Romali said when we were talking about NAICS codes, I think when you look at it from the perspective of, are NAICS codes the best way of approaching this, or, can you look at employee count, as ways to define what is small going forward? I think at the end of the day, when you look at it through the lens of job creation, that may be another way of looking at it. And so there again, if you have firms that are employing, in my case, several hundred, 400 employees, but you're able to combine forces to be considered with another company that is of that size, I think you're able to compete on more head-to-head basis with some of these companies. And lastly, when you're looking at it from the perspective of innovation, are you going to be getting innovation from the large behemoths, or are you going to be getting innovation from mid-sized and small businesses? And I think that ties to Mr. Molly's recommendation on the R&D side as well.
Right. That's and one of the biggest complaints that I receive, especially with subcontractors trying to bid on governmental projects, big projects in the congressional district, is with the definition of what's a small business. Right. And I know that's the topic of this, one of the topics of this committee hearing, but this question's for the entire panel. Do you believe that we need to change the way the SBA determines its size standards?
Yes.
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 What would be a better definition? What would be a better criteria for that?
Well, we've proposed, the Chamber of Commerce from Montgomery County, Maryland, has proposed changing the mathematical calculation for how you determine annual receipts. So we're staying within the paradigm of using annual revenue as the basis for calculation, right? But currently, it is an average of the firm's past 3 years of receipts. And we are suggesting that we extend that to no longer be such a narrow period of time. The way businesses grow these days in the federal marketplace, it's a lot of up and down, and then particularly a lot of up for a successful firm, and it will kick them out, it will slingshot them literally out of the small business programs into the full and open environment too quickly. So by extending the time period of measurement, you get a more accurate view of their true competitiveness.
I think I'm going to give you a realistic example because I sat and cranked the numbers yesterday on my firm. So as I said in my testimony, if I grow 36% in another year, I'm done at a $15 million size standard, right? But if you can take the lower, and we've grown year over year, but obviously the bigger you are, the more you're able to grow. If we had the lowest 3 years of 5, it would buy me at least 3 more years and allow me to grow enough and to get that infrastructure in place enough to then compete in what's now a mid-sized market or a large market with people that are in the $100, $200, $500 million range. So I think they need to look at the size standards to see if they really meet today's businesses and what you're buying. I think that's probably it's going to take a little bit of time to do. But this other proposal, I think from a realistic business owner sitting here today, could help just a tremendous cross-section of people. Again, because business is always up and down too, right? We work for Department of Commerce. We've got a census coming up, and we're dealing with something that may be a 1-year just huge blip. And if it wasn't my company and somebody else's, that would immediately knock them out of a program when the next year they're back down to maybe $1 million.
So the other thing I offer is what I offered before is revenue, and it's a little bit of a counter to my colleagues here. Is revenue the best indicator of size? It's certainly one metric, or things like employee headcount, job creation. Are they better metrics and rubrics to look at going forward? And I think that is one thing that should be strongly looked at, relative to how you define small and how you define mid. The last thing I'll point out is that should be up for consideration is allowing businesses some sort of transition period. Mm-hmm. And there again, if you look at my recommendation there, what had bipartisan support, I believe in 2011, that Small Business Growth Act, measure, and I think that was looking at a pilot program that looked at mid-sized businesses or set-asides for businesses that had 1,500 employees or less. Right. I think you could, by implementing a pilot program, look at the success or lack of success empirically of that program, and then decide whether what makes the most sense from a policy perspective. So try before you implement.
I would just add one thing is, sorry, Mr. Chairman, perhaps we need to also start looking at whether government contracting itself needs its own designation, because the other small businesses that don't participate in the government contracting marketplace can bring down
Right.
the overall size standard.
That's a good idea. Sorry I went over time, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. Thank you all very much.
Yeah, thanks. So I encourage you to be very engaged in us. We don't do hearings to hear you. We do hearings to hear from you and then engage in something that can help. So that's what we're trying to do. That's what we're trying to measure here. If I go back to Mr. Sangani, or I'm sorry, Mr. Romali said the 3 out of 5 years. Is that something that we might want to revisit again at some point and say now it's got to be 3 out of 7? Or was that something that you think would stand the test of time? In other words, you know, what happened in the 1920s doesn't happen today very much.
Yeah.
So things have to evolve. But if we're looking at something and we're saying, look, a small business is now being bumped into a mid-sized business and then either being forced to sell or go out of business or deny contracts, because I'm sure that's probably an option too, that you might say, can't take that contract. Is that something that we might want to revisit at some point too?
Absolutely. Our perspective is that, you know, 3 out of 7, straight 5, 3 out of 5, any of those options are better than the status quo. We have landed on 3 out of 5 for now for a couple reasons. One, the most contracts last 5 years, right? So there's kind of a neat, well, one contract cycle, if you've got 5 years of receipts under your belt. After that one contract cycle, you're truly large. That's probably the right time for you to be, forceful
Right.
and open. We don't want to be overbroad here, because we are genuinely concerned for the smallest of the smalls, and folks who may perceive that, oh, great, now that more businesses are going to be qualified as small, I may have enhanced competition. So we thought 3 out of 5 was a good balance there, because remember, the purpose of this change, or at least for our understanding, is that present competitiveness is not determined by present revenue. Right, so giving folks a little bit extra runway shouldn't really negatively affect the smaller smalls, because those folks really weren't significantly more competitive anyway. They were being graduated prematurely. Our other perception for that, or other understanding, was really that the more smalls there are, the more likely COs will be able to set aside contracts, because the rule of 2, which you guys are familiar with, will be satisfied more often. So the smallest of the smalls will have more opportunities, in theory, to compete if these changes were enacted. So
Well, let's continue to have that discussion and kind of figure out the balancing act, because I don't want, Ms. Firestone, when she's starting her business years ago, and she is the smallest of the small trying to get into the marketplace, then be overwhelmed by Ms. Firestone of 2018 because now she can't compete. And so we've kind of have that balancing act of, if you're a small business, we want you to be able to compete in the small business arena. But if you are a big small business, and now you're competing with these small businesses, you've grown out. Yeah. And
I
Yes,
think the one thing to consider is that as a small business, when I started out or got in government, I wouldn't be bidding on what I'm bidding on today.
True.
So I think that's a consideration. The other thing is that there's a lot of businesses like mine, and I think like yours, because we started small and we climbed the ladder, and with people that like WHIP, it's in our DNA to help the smaller businesses. So we have the small mentor protege program, which I think is helping that. So I think that's a consideration as well. I think it really will help the smalls to have those of us who have been through it continue to help them.
I mean, there again, I think there is, as Ms. Firestone noted, you bid on different things, and I think it's certainly at the discretion of the agency, procurement executives, the COs, to look at, okay, this particular contract, as we noted, if you do create a pilot program or a specific mid-size category, this particular requirement is better suited to that mid-size. We're going to set just that particular requirement aside, and then These other requirements are better suited to firms that are 15 million and below, and we're going to set that one aside for the smallest of the smalls. And there again, I think the benefit of having a program that perhaps is even a pilot program that examines that is it will give you the data and allow you to hear from constituents on what works and what doesn't work.
Well, I agree, and I want to thank Ms. Griffin for bringing up a couple words that always hit us, and that's fraud and abuse, and that's not doing the right thing. And the business that's doing the right thing is now incurring all of these costs because they are doing the right thing, and somebody who's swooping in is not. And for them to get a contract or for them to be able to build their business under poor practices or illegal activity is something we should always be concerned in, not just in small business, but across the board. And I deal with an awful lot of small businesses, especially in California. Our roofing industry out there is a industry that I work with almost weekly of the poor behavior that happens in that industry. And then you've got the business owner that is trying to make it and trying to win contracts and trying to do the right thing is now being penalized. But that's a balancing act, or that's a hard deal too. And you know that of how many folks do we have out there enforcing? How much enforcement do we do? How much penalties are levied? All of those types of things are difficult. So it's that's a tough one. I do believe there's going to be legislation out of this. I do believe that we're going to start to see some groundswell. This is something that's talked about quite a bit. It's talked about because small businesses are the backbone of the economy, and we don't want you to go out of business. We want you to thrive. So, again, I thank you for your time today. I thank you for your patience. I pride myself on punctuality, and I wasn't very today. So I ask unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days to submit statements and supporting materials for the record. Without objection, so ordered. The hearing is now adjourned.